Shattering porcelain echoed down the grand staircase, punctuated by a child's raw, ragged scream. It wasn't a spoiled brat denied a toy. It was an animal caught in a snare. Paralyzed in the grand foyer, a dozen servants watched Arthur, Duke of Ashbourne, stare blankly at the bottom step. A half-empty glass of gin trembled in his hand. Nobody breathed. His 7-year-old heirs were actively destroying themselves behind locked doors, and no one had the spine to stop them. Ashbourne Manor was less a home and more a mausoleum built of pale stone and heavy oak. Ever since the Duchess died of a sudden violent fever 2 years prior, the house had been holding its breath. The curtains were drawn, the silver tarnished. The Duke, Arthur, had retreated into the east wing, barricading himself behind ledgers he didn't read and decanters he emptied with alarming speed. He left the raising of his 7-year-old twin boys, Leo and Harry, to a revolving door of highly recommended, heavily paid, and thoroughly traumatized women. The boys were terrors. They were not mischievous. They were feral. They bit. They scratched. They tore tapestries from the walls and poured ink into the grand piano. They were small, pale things with their father's dark hair and their mother's striking blue eyes, moving through the manor like a twin-headed plague. They trusted no one. They hated everyone. But most of all, they hated anyone who tried to replace the warmth that had been abruptly ripped from their lives. Governess number 4 lasted a month. Governess number 7 lasted 3 days. Then there was Bridget. Bridget Hayes was not a governess. She was a scullery maid who had recently been promoted to the upstairs grates because she didn't complain about the heavy coal buckets. She was 22, but her hands looked 40. They were red, cracked from lye soap, and permanently dusted with ash. She had a sharp jaw, dull brown hair shoved carelessly under a cap, and a demeanor that could freeze a boiling kettle. She wasn't paid to care about the young lords, so she didn't. Her first interaction with the twins happened on a dreary Tuesday in October. Bridget was on her hands and knees in the second-floor corridor, scrubbing a stubborn wax stain from the floorboards. The boys had been lurking in the shadows, armed with a bucket of stagnant rainwater and dead leaves they'd dragged up from the gutters. They tipped it over her. Filthy water cascaded down Bridget's back, soaking her coarse wool dress to the skin. The dead leaves plastered against her neck. The boys stood back, chests heaving, waiting for the reaction. They expected tears. They expected her to run screaming to the housekeeper. They expected the familiar, satisfying rush of power. Bridget stopped scrubbing. She didn't gasp. Slowly she wrung out her rag into a wooden pail. She'd stood up, her skirt dripping muddy water onto the newly ruined floorboards. She looked at Leo. She looked at Harry. Her face was entirely blank. "You missed a spot," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any inflection. She handed the scrub brush to Leo. He stared at it, bewildered. He didn't take it. Bridget didn't insist. She simply dropped the wet brush into the puddle, picked up her heavy bucket, and walked away. The water squelched in her boots. She didn't look back. The boys were outraged. They hated her immediately. Over the next few weeks, they targeted her. They hid dead mice in her coal scuttle. She picked them up by the tails and tossed them into the fire without blinking. They threw marbles down the servants' stairs when she was carrying linens. She stepped over them with the irritated precision of someone avoiding horse dung in the street. She never yelled. She never reported them. She simply looked at them with a profound, crushing boredom. To Leo and Harry, who thrived on the chaos they created, Bridget's indifference was the ultimate insult. They scorned her. When she walked into a room to tend the fire, they would loudly mimic her heavy, tired walk. Bridget would just strike the match, light the kindling, and leave. She had a sick sister in the village to pay for. She didn't have the time or the energy to entertain 2 rich, grieving brats who thought the world ended at their doorstep. She knew exactly what grief was. It didn't wear velvet and throw tantrums. It wore holes in your shoes and made you cough up blood. Let the Duke handle his own mess. November brought a storm that rattled the very foundations of Ashbourne Manor. The wind howled off the moors, tearing at the slate roof and violently shaking the window panes. It was a miserable, suffocating night. It was also the second anniversary of the Duchess's death. The entire house knew it. The staff walked on eggshells, communicating only in sharp whispers. The Duke had not emerged from his study since breakfast. The current governess, a timid vicar's daughter named Miss Abbott, had been instructed to keep the boys in the nursery and keep them quiet. It was an impossible task. The anniversary had tightened the invisible coil inside the twins until it snapped. It started at supper. Miss Abbott tried to serve them poached fish. Harry threw his plate against the wall. When Miss Abbott reached out to scold him, Leo bit her wrist, drawing blood. The boys fled to the grand drawing room, their mother's favourite room, which had been locked for 2 years. Somehow they had stolen the key. By 9 o'clock, the storm outside was rivaled only by the destruction inside. Bridget was polishing the brass fixtures in the hallway below when she heard the first crash. It sounded like heavy furniture being tipped over. Then came the sound of tearing fabric. Then the shattering of glass. A crowd of servants had gathered in the foyer, wringing their hands. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was pale and shaking. Miss Abbott was sobbing into a handkerchief, clutching her bleeding wrist. At the bottom of the grand staircase stood Arthur, the Duke of Ashbourne. He wore a rumpled linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. His face was a grey, hollow mask. He was staring up at the closed double doors of the drawing room at the top of the landing. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable pleaded, her voice trembling. "They are breaking the china, the Sèvres porcelain. We cannot get in. They've dragged a heavy cabinet across the door." Arthur didn't move. He took a slow, deliberate sip from the glass in his hand. The ice clinked. He looked like a man watching a ship sink from the shore, knowing he couldn't swim. "Leave them," Arthur whispered, his voice raspy. "But Your Grace—" "I said leave them!" he barked, the sudden volume making the staff flinch. He sagged against the banister, rubbing a hand over his face. "If they wish to tear the house down, let them. There is nothing worth saving in it anyway." A fresh chorus of crashes echoed from above. A high-pitched, hysterical wail followed, not of anger, but of blind panic. It was Harry. He was screaming, a breathless, tearing sound that scraped against the eardrums. The Duke closed his eyes and turned away, walking back towards the east wing. He was leaving. Again, Bridget watched him go. She looked at the huddled, terrified servants. She looked at the sobbing governess. The hypocrisy of it all tasted foul in her mouth. This grand house, all this money, all this power, and not a single adult among them had the spine to face 2 terrified 7-year-olds. Bridget set her brass polish down on a side table. The dull thud drew Mrs. Gable's attention. "Bridget, get back to the kitchens!" the housekeeper hissed. Bridget ignored her. She wiped her blackened hands on her coarse apron. She bypassed the clustered staff, walked to the bottom of the stairs, and began to climb. "Bridget!" Mrs. Gable whispered harshly. "What are you doing? The Duke forbade it." Bridget didn't stop. She reached the landing and stood before the heavy mahogany doors of the drawing room. The screaming inside was deafening. It sounded like a slaughterhouse. She placed her hand against the wood. She could feel the vibrations of things being smashed against the walls. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She reached into her deep apron pocket and pulled out the heavy ring of iron skeleton keys she carried for the coal cellars and storage rooms. One of them, she knew, opened the servants' passage that led directly behind the fireplace in the drawing room. A passage the boys didn't know about. She turned the corner, slipping into the dark, narrow servants' corridor. It smelled of old dust and mice. She felt her way along the cold stone wall until she found the hidden latch. She pressed it. The wooden panel groaned and swung inward. Bridget stepped into the drawing room. The room looked as though a bomb had detonated inside it. The heavy silk curtains had been ripped from their rods and lay in tangled heaps on the Persian rugs. The upholstered chairs were overturned. A towering glass display cabinet had been shoved face first onto the floor, scattering fragments of priceless porcelain across the room like jagged snow. In the center of the wreckage stood Leo, breathing heavily, wielding a heavy brass fire poker. His hands were bleeding from the broken glass. In the corner, huddled beneath a mahogany writing desk, was Harry. He was the one screaming, his hands clamped tightly over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut. He was rocking back and forth, trapped in a panic attack so severe his lips were turning blue. Leo spun around as the secret door clicked shut behind Bridget. He raised the poker, his small face contorted in a mask of feral rage. Tears were streaming down his dirt-streaked cheeks. "Get out!" Leo screamed. His voice cracked. "Get out, you ugly rat! I'll hit you! I swear I'll hit you!" Bridget didn't flinch. She looked at the heavy brass poker. A solid hit could crack her skull. She looked at Leo's trembling arms. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a soothing, cooing voice. She simply stepped forward, her heavy boots crunching on the broken Sèvres porcelain. "Stop!" Leo shrieked, taking a swing. He didn't hit her, but he struck a side table, sending a silver candelabra clattering to the floor. Bridget walked right up to him. She didn't kneel to his level. She stood tall, her shadow falling over him. Leo froze, panting, looking up at her stony face. He expected her to strike him. He braced for it. Instead, Bridget reached out and calmly, firmly took hold of the brass poker. Leo tugged, but he was 7, and she hauled 100-pound coal sacks for a living. She pulled the poker from his grip effortlessly and tossed it behind her. It clattered against the wall. Leo stared at his empty hands. The sudden loss of his weapon broke something in him. He let out a ragged sob and launched himself at her, his small fists pummeling against her thighs, her stomach, wherever he could reach. "I hate you! I hate you! We hate you!" He screamed, beating his bleeding knuckles against her heavy wool skirt. Bridget stood perfectly still. She let him hit her. It hurt, but she didn't move. She just looked down at him. "Are you done?" she asked. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was just tired. Leo stopped. He looked up at her, chest heaving, his face red and slick with tears. He looked confused. Why wasn't she yelling? Why wasn't she running away? Harry was still screaming under the desk. Bridget stepped past Leo, crunching over the glass, and walked to the desk. She didn't try to pull Harry out. She didn't try to touch him. She sat down on the floor, crossing her legs, ignoring the shards of porcelain pressing into her skirt. She leaned her back against the desk, right next to where Harry was hiding, and pulled a small, battered tin from her apron. She opened it. It was peppermint salve she used for her cracked knuckles. The sharp, clean scent of peppermint cut through the dusty, stale air of the room. Harry's screams hitched. He cracked one eye open, peering out from the darkness under the desk. He saw her worn black boot. He smelled the mint. "My sister," Bridget said to the empty room, her voice a low, steady rumble. "Used to scream just like that when the fever got bad. Used to scream until she made herself sick." She scooped a bit of the salve and began rubbing it into her raw hands. Didn't fix the fever, though. Just made her throat hurt on top of it. Harry stopped rocking. He stared at her back. Leo had crept closer, holding his bleeding hand. He was watching Bridget with wide, wary eyes. "You're bleeding," Bridget noted, looking at Leo's hand. She didn't rush to coddle him. She held out the tin of salve. "Put some of this on it. It stings, but it keeps the dirt out." Leo hesitated. He looked at the tin, then at Bridget's impassive face. Slowly, cautiously, like a stray dog approaching a stranger, he reached out and dipped his fingers into the tin. He rubbed it on his cuts and winced sharply. Bridget didn't offer sympathy. "Told you it stung." Under the desk, Harry finally lowered his hands from his ears. The room was quiet now, save for the wind outside and the steady ticking of a mantel clock that had survived the carnage. "She's gone," Harry whispered. It was a tiny, broken sound. Bridget stopped rubbing her hands. She knew who he meant. The whole house knew. "Yes," Bridget said bluntly. "She is. There was no, 'she's watching over you from heaven.' No, she wouldn't want you to be sad. Just the cold, hard truth." Harry crawled out from under the desk. He looked around the destroyed room, as if seeing it for the first time. He looked at the torn curtains and the smashed glass. The adrenaline was leaving him, replaced by a crushing physical exhaustion. He looked at Bridget. She didn't look back with pity. She just looked at him as one human being looks at another. Without a word, Harry stepped forward and collapsed against her side. He buried his face in her coarse apron, right over the spot where her hands smelled of lye and peppermint. He didn't cry. He just breathed, long and shuddering. A moment later, Leo walked over. He sat on the floor on Bridget's other side, pulling his knees to his chest, leaning his head against her shoulder. Bridget didn't wrap her arms around them. She didn't stroke their hair. She just sat there in the ruins of the drawing room, a solid, unmoving pillar in the center of their wreckage. For the first time in 2 years, the heirs of Ashbourne Manor were quiet. Dawn arrived at Ashbourne Manor, not with a golden glow, but with a cold grey crawl that seeped through the cracks of the drawn curtains. Outside the drawing room, the hallway was a gallery of exhausted anxiety. Mrs. Gable had sat in a stiff-backed chair all night, a rosary threaded through her fingers. The remaining staff hovered near the stairs, trading nervous glances. Miss Abbott had packed her bags at midnight and departed before first light, preferring the perilous moors in the dark to another hour in the house. At 6 a.m, the heavy footsteps of the Duke sounded on the landing. Arthur's cravat was missing. His waistcoat was misbuttoned. He smelled strongly of juniper and old despair. He looked at the housekeeper, then at the heavy mahogany doors. "They are quiet," Arthur rasped. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Quiet usually meant they had found a way out onto the roof, or had discovered his hunting knives. "Not a sound since midnight, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable whispered, standing up quickly. "We dared not intervene. You gave strict orders." Arthur didn't look at her. He pushed past, placing his hand on the brass handle of the drawing-room door. He expected resistance. He expected the heavy cabinet to still be wedged against the frame. But when he turned the knob, the door gave way with a smooth click. The barricade had been moved. He pushed the doors open. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust, cracked plaster, and crushed peppermint. The devastation was absolute. His wife's favorite chairs were eviscerated, their horsehair stuffing scattered like dead weeds. The Sèvres porcelain, a wedding gift from the king, was a carpet of jagged blue and gold dust. But Arthur barely registered the wreckage. His eyes snagged on the center of the room. Bridget was sitting on the floor, her back braced against the edge of a mahogany writing desk. Her coarse wool skirt was spread out around her, covered in fine dust and glass shards. Leo was asleep on her left. His head was tucked against her collarbone, his breathing slow and even, his filthy hands curled into loose fists in his lap. Harry was asleep on her right. He was sprawled sideways, his face pressed deeply into the rough fabric of her apron, one arm slung over her knee. Bridget was awake. Her eyes were open, staring at the cold fireplace. She didn't look up when the doors opened. She simply turned her head, her gaze shifting to the Duke. She didn't gasp. She didn't scramble to her feet, curtsy, or beg forgiveness for intruding. To move would wake the boys. So she remained perfectly still. Mrs. Gable let out a strangled gasp from the doorway. "Bridget! By God, what are you doing in here? Get up at once! You insolent!" "Quiet." The word left Arthur's mouth before he even thought it. His voice was low, but it commanded the room. Mrs. Gable snapped her mouth shut. Arthur stepped over a shattered vase, his leather boots crunching loudly in the dead silence of the room. He stopped 3 feet from Bridget. He looked down at her. He studied the ash on her forehead, the red, raw skin of her knuckles resting on her knees, the complete lack of deference in her flat, brown eyes. "Who are you?" Arthur asked. "Bridget Hayes, Your Grace," she said softly, keeping her voice to a low rumble that wouldn't disturb the children. "You are a maid." "Scullery and grates, yes." Arthur looked at his sons. He hadn't seen them sleep in months. Not truly sleep. Usually they passed out from sheer exhaustion, twitching and whimpering in the nursery beds until the nightmares woke them screaming. Now their faces were slack. The feral tension that always gripped their small jaws was gone. "Miss Abbott is gone," Arthur said, the realization hitting him as he stared at his quiet heirs. "Good," Bridget replied flatly. She was a mouse trying to herd wolverines. Mrs. Gable made another choking sound of outrage. Arthur raised a hand, silencing the housekeeper without looking at her. He kept his eyes on Bridget. Her audacity was jarring. People did not speak to him like this. They bowed, they scraped, they offered platitudes about his loss and excuses for his children. This girl just sat in the dirt and stated facts. "You cleared the barricade," Arthur noted, looking at the heavy oak cabinet that had been shoved a foot to the left, just enough to let the doors open. "I did. It takes 3 footmen to move that cabinet. Footmen are weak," Bridget said. She shifted slightly, her leg cramping. Leo stirred, letting out a soft sigh, and buried his face deeper into her shoulder. Bridget waited for him to settle before speaking again. "I carry 100-pound coal sacks up 3 flights of stairs twice a day. A cabinet on a polished floor is nothing." Arthur felt a strange, uncomfortable tightness in his chest. It was a sensation he usually drowned with gin. He looked around the ruined room again, then back to the maid. "You will move your things to the nursery chambers today," Arthur commanded. "You are their governess now." Bridget finally frowned. A deep crease appeared between her brows. "No." Arthur blinked. "No? I am not a governess," Bridget said. "I read slowly, my penmanship is atrocious, and I don't know the first thing about French or piano. I clean grates, I scrub floors. That is what I am paid for." "I will double your wages," Arthur countered, his voice rising a fraction, a spark of irritation cutting through his hangover. "No." Arthur clenched his jaw. "Triple." Bridget looked at him. She really looked at him. She saw the bloodshot eyes, the trembling hands, the aristocratic arrogance trying to mask a desperate, flailing panic. £30 a year, Bridget said evenly. Mrs. Gable gasped again. £30 was an extortionate sum. It was nearly what the head cook made. £30, Bridget repeated, her voice steady. "And a promise that I answer only to you. Not to Mrs. Gable, not to the steward, just you. I have a sister in the village with consumption. £30 pays for Dr. Hughes to visit her twice a week, and keeps her in clean linens. If you want me to keep your boys from tearing this house down, you will pay for my sister to breathe." Arthur stared at her. He saw the iron in her spine. He saw the exact calculation in her eyes. She wasn't holding him hostage. She was conducting a transaction. Survival for survival. "Done," Arthur said. He turned on his heel, his boots crunching over the porcelain again. "Mrs. Gable, see to it that Miss Hayes is moved upstairs by noon, and send up a basin. She smells like a chimney." He walked out, closing the double doors with a sharp snap behind him. Bridget let out a long, slow breath. She looked down at the 2 dark heads resting against her. £30. It was a fortune. It was life for Clara. Slowly, carefully, Bridget nudged Leo's shoulder. "Wake up, lad," she murmured. "The floor is getting hard, and you have broken glass in your breeches." By Tuesday, the nursery on the 3rd floor had been stripped. When Bridget moved her meagre belongings, one trunk containing 2 coarse dresses, a shawl, and a tin of peppermint salve, she evaluated the boys' domain. It was a sprawling suite filled with rocking horses, tin soldiers, mechanical trains from Germany, and velvet cushions. It was a playroom designed for delicate lords. Bridget ordered the footmen to pack it all away. "Every toy, every book they throw, every cushion they rip," Bridget instructed, standing in the center of the room with her arms crossed. Leo and Harry stood in the doorway, watching in absolute horror as a pair of burly footmen carted away a massive, painted wooden ark. "You can't do that," Leo yelled, stepping forward, his fists balling up. "Those are ours. My father bought them." "Your father pays me to keep you alive and the house intact," Bridget said, not looking at him, but watching the footmen to ensure they didn't scuff the wainscoting. "You use your toys as weapons, so you don't get toys." "I'll bite you!" Harry threatened, his voice pitching high with panic. He bared his teeth, looking exactly like a cornered fox. Bridget finally turned to them. She walked over, her heavy boots thudding on the carpet. She stopped just out of biting range. If you bite me, Harry, I will put soap in your mouth. And it won't be the nice lavender soap you use. It will be the lye soap I use to scrub the kitchen floors. It tastes like burning ash." She delivered this information with the same tone she might use to announce it was raining outside. Harry snapped his mouth shut. "But what are we supposed to do?" Leo demanded, angry tears threatening to spill. "We have nothing to play with." "You aren't playing today," Bridget said. She turned and picked up a heavy woven wicker basket from the floor. She tossed it at Leo's chest. He caught it purely on reflex, stumbling backward under its weight. "What is this?" Leo asked, looking down at the rough wicker. "A laundry basket," Bridget said. "Put your boots on, the heavy ones. We are going to the kitchen gardens." The transition was violent, but not in the way the staff expected. There were no screams echoing down the halls. There was no shattering glass. Instead, there was an exhausted, sullen silence. Bridget didn't teach them Latin. She didn't teach them the lineages of the European monarchs. She taught them how to pull weeds. The November ground was hard, cold, and unforgiving. Bridget marched them out to the walled kitchen garden behind the manor, a place the young lords had never been allowed to go. The head gardener, an old man named Higgins, stared in slack-jawed shock as Bridget handed the two heirs of the Ashbourne dukedom a pair of iron trowels. "The carrots need thinning," Bridget told them, pointing to a long raised bed of dark soil. "You pull the small ones so the big ones have room to grow. Put the weeds in the bucket. Put the carrots in the basket." "I am a lord," Leo stated, his chin jutting out, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Lords do not dig in the dirt. Lords eat carrots." Bridget replied smoothly, "And if you want supper tonight, you'll dig. Go on." They refused. For 2 hours they stood by the raised bed, shivering in their wool coats, refusing to touch the dirt. Bridget didn't yell. She didn't coax. She simply took a hoe and began turning the soil in the next row over. The rhythmic thwack, scrape of the metal against the earth was the only sound. By the 3rd hour, the cold and the sheer boredom won. Harry crouched down first. He tentatively poked at the soil. He pulled a weed. He looked at Bridget, expecting praise. Bridget just kept hoeing. Leo watched his brother, then scowled, dropped to his knees, and began ripping weeds out with aggressive, jerky motions. It was miserable work. Their hands grew cold and cramped. Their pristine boots were caked in thick, freezing mud. But an hour into it, a strange shift occurred. The frantic, nervous energy that always hummed beneath their skin began to dissipate, bleeding out into the soil. When a large, fat earthworm surfaced near Harry's trowel, he gasped, dropping the tool. "Bridget!" Harry squeaked, pointing a muddy finger. "A snake!" Bridget stopped hoeing. She walked over, leaned down, and scooped the wriggling worm into her bare hand. She held it out. "It's a worm, Harry. It eats dirt and makes the soil good for the vegetables." Leo leaned in, his eyes wide, completely forgetting to be angry. "Can I touch it?" "If you don't squeeze it," Bridget said. Leo poked the worm with a muddy finger. He grinned, a real, actual grin, splitting his dirt-smudged face. It was the first time Bridget had seen either of them smile. It transformed him from a feral creature into a little boy. "Put him back in the dirt," Bridget instructed, tipping her hand. "He has work to do, and so do you." For the next week, this was the routine. When they woke up, they didn't have time to brood or plan destruction. Bridget had them hauling firewood to the kitchen. She had them churning butter until their arms shook. She had them polishing the massive silver candelabras in the dining room. She treated them not as fragile, broken things to be pitied, but as capable human beings with a job to do. She gave them boundaries made of iron, and within those boundaries, they found something they desperately needed: predictability. They realized quickly that throwing a tantrum achieved nothing. Bridget wouldn't react. She would just wait them out, and the chore would still be there when they finished screaming. They also realized she didn't lie to them. When she said something would hurt, it did. When she said they would get a baked apple with cinnamon if they finished stacking the wood, they got the baked apple. She was a fixed point in their chaotic universe. One evening, after a particularly grueling afternoon of scrubbing down the tack room in the stables, they were sitting by the fire in the nursery. The room was bare, save for their beds and a large rug, but the heat from the hearth was glorious. Harry was leaning against Bridget's leg as she sat in a wooden chair, darning a hole in Leo's stocking. Leo was lying on his stomach on the rug, staring into the flames. "Bridget?" Leo asked, his voice quiet. "What?" she replied, her needle flashing in the firelight. "Do you think—" Leo hesitated, swallowing hard. "Do you think my mother would be angry that we dig in the dirt?" Bridget stopped sewing. She looked down at the boy. This was the trap. This was where the governesses always failed. They offered sweet, empty lies about a dead woman they never knew. "I didn't know your mother," Bridget said truthfully. "But I know dead people don't care about dirt. They only care that the people they left behind are still breathing." Leo was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I stacked 30 logs today." "You did," Bridget agreed. "You're getting stronger." Harry shifted against her leg. "I stacked 20. You have shorter arms." Bridget noted. "Now, get up, both of you. Time to wash your faces. You look like chimney sweeps." There was no protest, no whining. They just stood up and walked to the wash basin. 2 weeks into Bridget's tenure, Arthur realized his house was entirely too quiet. He was sitting in his study, a ledger open on the desk, a glass of gin halfway to his mouth. He paused. He listened. There was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. There was the distant clatter of a maid sweeping the stairs. But there was no screaming. There was no crashing. There was no sound of running feet, followed by the hysterical sobbing of a governess. The silence was unsettling. It felt like holding one's breath before a plunge into cold water. Arthur set his glass down. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. He walked out of his study, crossing the grand foyer. He headed toward the stairs, but stopped. The silence wasn't just upstairs. It permeated the whole house. He found Mrs. Gable in the dining room, inspecting the silver. "Where are my sons?" Arthur demanded. Mrs. Gable jumped, nearly dropping a gravy boat. She curtsied hastily. "Your Grace, they are with Miss Hayes." "I assumed that. Where are they?" Mrs. Gable's face tightened. A look of deep disapproval washed over her features. "They are in the stables, Your Grace. Mucking out the stalls." Arthur stared at her. "Mucking out the stalls? The horses' stalls?" "Yes, Your Grace. Miss Hayes insists it is character building." Mrs. Gable practically choked on the words. Arthur turned without another word and strode toward the back of the house. He pushed through the heavy oak doors that led to the courtyard, the freezing November wind biting at his unbuttoned collar. He crossed the cobblestones, the smell of hay, manure, and damp earth growing stronger as he approached the large stone stables. He stepped through the wide double doors, into the dim, warm interior. He heard them before he saw them. "You missed a spot, Harry, right in the corner. If you leave it, the horse will get rot in his hooves." It was Bridget's voice, flat and unyielding. "It smells," Harry complained, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "So do you," Leo's voice fired back, accompanied by the wet, heavy sound of a pitchfork scraping stone. "Keep shoveling. Bridget said if we finish by noon, we can help the cook knead the bread." Arthur rounded the corner of the first row of stalls. He stopped dead. His sons, the heirs to one of the oldest dukedoms in England, were knee-deep in dirty straw and horse manure. They wore heavy canvas aprons over thick, rough spun shirts that belonged to stable boys, not lords. Their faces were smeared with dirt, their hair was matted with sweat and chaff, and they were wielding small pitchforks with surprising efficiency. Bridget was standing by the stall door, leaning against the wooden frame. She wore the same dark wool dress, a thick shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She was watching them, a bucket of fresh sawdust at her feet. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur's voice boomed through the stables, causing the horses to stamp nervously. Leo and Harry froze, dropping their pitchforks. They looked at their father, their eyes wide and suddenly guarded. The easy, focused rhythm they had been working in vanished, replaced by the tense, feral alertness Arthur recognized. Bridget didn't jump. She slowly turned her head, fixing her flat, brown gaze on the Duke. "They are cleaning the stalls, Your Grace," she said, as if explaining it to a simpleton. "They are lords," Arthur snapped, closing the distance between them, his anger flaring. This was wrong. This was entirely inappropriate. They do not shovel manure. They have arms, legs, and a severe surplus of anger. Bridget replied, not backing down an inch. She didn't lower her eyes. Manure is heavy. Shoveling it burns the anger out. It also teaches them that the world doesn't magically clean itself up after they destroy it. "You overstep, Miss Hayes," Arthur growled, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He looked at his sons. They were filthy. They looked like common laborers. "Get out of that stall. Go to the house and wash this instant." Leo looked at Bridget. Harry looked at his boots. Neither of them moved. Arthur felt a spike of genuine shock. They weren't moving. They were waiting for her permission. "I gave you an order!" Arthur yelled, stepping forward. Harry flinched, shrinking back against the wooden wall of the stall. Leo stepped in front of his brother, raising his chin, glaring at his father with a terrifying, familiar defiance. Bridget moved. She stepped cleanly between the Duke and the open stall door, physically blocking Arthur's path to the boys. "Don't shout at them," Bridget said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its flat indifference and taking on the hard, sharp edge of a blade. "Do not tell me how to speak to my own children!" Arthur roared, looming over her. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing, but Bridget stood her ground like a stone pillar. "Then speak to them like a father, not a commander," Bridget fired back. "You bark orders from the shadows, you lock yourself away with your djinn, and you expect them to act like perfect gentlemen. They are 7 years old, Your Grace. Their mother died, and their father abandoned them. What did you expect them to become?" The words struck Arthur like a physical blow. He staggered back half a step, the breath knocked out of his lungs. "How dare you?" he breathed, his face draining of color. "I dare because you pay me £30 a year to keep them from breaking apart," Bridget said, her voice lowering again, intense and furious. "They don't need a lord right now, Your Grace. They need a parent. And since you refuse to be one, I will teach them how to survive the only way I know how, through work, through reality." Arthur stared at her. He could smell the peppermint salve on her hands mingling with the scent of the stables. He saw the fierce, protective set of her shoulders. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a shield. And she was shielding his sons from him. He looked past her, at Leo and Harry. They were watching him, clutching each other's dirty hands. They didn't look angry anymore. They looked terrified. They looked terrified of him. The realization tasted like ash in Arthur's mouth. He didn't say another word. He couldn't. His throat had closed up. He turned around, his boots heavy on the stone floor, and walked out of the stables, leaving his sons in the dirt with the only person in the world who seemed to give a damn about putting them back together. Bridget watched him go until he disappeared into the courtyard. She took a deep breath, letting the cold air clear the adrenaline from her blood. She turned back to the stall. Leo and Harry were staring at her, wide-eyed. No one had ever spoken to their father like that and survived. "Right," Bridget said, her voice returning to its usual flat, practical tone. She pointed at a pile of manure in the corner. "You missed that spot, Harry. Shovel it up. We have bread to knead." Arthur did not return to his study after the stables. He went to his bedchamber. He walked to the washstand, picked up the heavy crystal decanter of gin he kept there for the nights when the silence was too loud, and poured it into the ceramic basin. The sharp, botanical smell filled the room. It smelled like cowardice. For 2 days, Arthur suffered. The withdrawal hit him like a physical beating. His hands shook so violently he could not hold a pen. He sweated through his linen shirts. He paced the floorboards of the east wing until his joints ached, fighting the desperate, clawing urge to summon a servant and demand a bottle. Nobody came to check on him. Bridget didn't send up a tray of broth. She didn't offer pity. She was busy keeping his children alive. and Arthur realized with a sickening clarity that if he died in this room, the house would simply continue functioning without him. He had made himself entirely obsolete. On the third morning, the trembling subsided to a dull vibration in his fingertips. He dressed himself. His cravat was crooked, and his face was drawn and grey, but he was sober. He found them in the vast kitchens below stairs. The kitchen staff, usually a bustling, shouting army, was entirely silent. The head cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Patmore, was standing in the corner, clutching a wooden spoon and looking terrified. In the centre of the room, at the massive, flour-dusted oak table, stood Bridget, Leo, and Harry. They were making bread. Harry was standing on a sturdy wooden crate, his small fists buried in a mound of sticky dough. There was flour in his dark hair and a smear of white across his nose. Leo was aggressively pounding a separate lump of dough, attacking it with the same feral intensity he used to reserve for destroying furniture. Bridget stood between them, scraping the edges of the table with a metal bench knife. Arthur stopped in the doorway. The warmth of the ovens washed over him, smelling of yeast and burning applewood. He stood there for a long moment, simply watching. His sons looked completely alien to him. They were messy. They were focused. They weren't screaming. "You're overworking it, Leo," Bridget said, not looking up from her scraping. "Bread isn't a beggar you're trying to beat. It's a living thing. You have to stretch it, not crush it." Leo scowled, but he stopped hitting the dough. He looked at his hands, then tried to mimic the smooth, rolling motion Bridget had shown him. Arthur stepped into the kitchen. The heavy thud of his boots made the boys freeze. Harry's hands remained stuck in the dough. Leo stepped back from the table, wiping his floury hands on his coarse apron, his jaw tightening. The familiar, defensive wall slammed down over their faces. Arthur felt the rejection like a knife in the ribs. He ignored the terrified cook. He walked straight to the oak table. He didn't look at Bridget. He looked at the lump of dough in front of Leo. "May I?" Arthur asked. His voice was raspy from disuse. Leo blinked. He looked at his father's expensive wool coat, then at the flour-covered table. Cautiously, the 7-year-old took another step back, yielding the space. Arthur took off his coat and draped it over a chair. He rolled up the sleeves of his pristine white shirt, exposing the dark hair on his forearms. He stepped up to the table. He plunged his hands into the dough. It was cold, wet, and immensely sticky. It clung to his skin, resisting his movements. "You need flour," Bridget said. Arthur looked at her. Her flat, brown eyes held no judgment but no deference either. She reached into a wooden barrel, scooped a handful of flour, and unceremoniously dumped it directly over Arthur's hands. A cloud of white dust billowed up, settling on his silk waistcoat. "Push with the heel of your hand," Bridget instructed, stepping beside him. "Fold it over. Turn it. Do it again." Arthur did as he was told. He pushed. He folded. He turned. The rhythmic, physical repetition demanded focus. It left no room in his head for ghosts or gin. On the other side of the table, Harry slowly resumed kneading his own dough, his eyes darting to his father every few seconds. Leo drifted back to the table, standing close to Arthur's elbow. "You're doing it wrong," Leo muttered, pointing a small, floury finger. "You're tearing it. Bridget says you have to stretch it." Arthur stopped. He looked down at the torn gluten in the dough. He looked at his son. "Show me," Arthur said. Leo hesitated. Then he reached over, his small, warm hands pressing against his father's large, shaking ones. "Like this," the boy said, guiding Arthur's hands. "Push, fold, turn." Arthur swallowed the heavy lump in his throat. He nodded. "Push, fold, turn." For an hour the Duke of Ashbourne made bread in his own kitchen. He didn't speak of the past. He didn't offer empty apologies. He simply stood shoulder to shoulder with his sons, covered in dirt and flour, trying to learn how to stretch something without breaking it. Bridget stepped back, leaning against the cold stone of the hearth. She wiped a smudge of flour from her cheek and watched the 3 men of the house. It was a messy, clumsy start. But it was a start. Winter tightened its grip on Yorkshire in January. The moors froze solid. and the wind screamed around the stone turrets of Ashbourne Manor like a dying animal. It was during a blinding snowstorm that the fragile peace Bridget had constructed shattered. It started with a cough. By supper, Harry's skin was flushed, his eyes glassy and unfocused. By midnight, he was burning. Bridget was sitting by the nursery fire when Leo came padding out of the bedroom, his face pale with terror. "He's hot, Bridget," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "He won't wake up. He sounds like a broken bellows." Bridget dropped her mending. She walked swiftly into the bedroom. Harry was thrashing in the sheets, his small chest heaving as he fought for air. The harsh, barking sound of the croup rattled in his throat. It was the same sound Clara had made before her lungs started bleeding. Bridget didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for the rich. She pressed the back of her hand to Harry's forehead. He was dangerously hot. "Leo," Bridget said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Go to the kitchen. Tell Mrs. Patmore to boil water, buckets of it, and bring me the willow bark from the pantry. Run." Leo didn't argue. He bolted. Bridget stripped the heavy blankets off Harry. She went to the washstand, cracked the ice in the pitcher, and soaked a towel. She began dragging the freezing cloth over Harry's chest and neck, trying to pull the heat out of his blood. 10 minutes later, the door slammed open. But it wasn't Leo. It was Arthur. He was wearing his dressing gown, his face entirely devoid of color. He stood in the doorway, staring at the bed. His eyes were wide, unblinking, trapped in a nightmare. He wasn't seeing Harry. He was seeing the Duchess. He was seeing the blood on the pillows, the violent, seizing fever that had ripped his wife from the world in less than 48 hours. "No!" Arthur gasped, backing away, his hands flying to his head. "No, no, not again! I can't! I can't do this again!" He turned to run. He was going to flee back to the East Wing. He was going to find a bottle and drown the screaming in his head. "Arthur!" The name cracked through the room like a whip. It was the first time she had ever used his Christian name. Arthur froze, his hand on the doorframe. He looked back. Bridget dropped the wet towel. She marched across the room, grabbed the heavy lapels of his silk dressing gown, and slammed him back against the doorframe. The impact rattled his teeth. "Look at me!" Bridget snarled, her face inches from his. "Look at me!" Arthur blinked, his chest heaving, his eyes frantically darting around the room. "She is dead," Bridget said, her voice dropping into a vicious, guttural whisper. "Your wife is dead, and she is never coming back. But your son is burning alive in that bed, and if you walk out that door right now, you will lose him too. And this time, it will be your fault." Arthur stared at her. The blunt, brutal honesty of her words pierced through the panic. "I don't know what to do," Arthur choked out, a single tear cutting a track down his grey cheek. "I don't know how to save him." "You don't have to save him," Bridget said, her grip softening on his lapels, though she didn't let go. "You just have to sit with him. He is terrified. He thinks the fever is going to take him away like it took his mother. Go sit in that chair and hold his hand. Show him you aren't leaving." Arthur swallowed hard. He looked at the bed. Harry let out another barking, agonizing cough. Arthur nodded. Bridget released him. For the next 8 hours, Ashbourne Manor fought a war against the fever. Leo returned with the boiling water, filling the room with thick, hot steam to loosen Harry's lungs. Bridget brewed bitter willowbark tea, forcing it down Harry's throat drop by drop. And Arthur stayed. He sat in the wooden chair beside the bed. He didn't flinch when Harry vomited onto his silk dressing gown. He didn't pull away when the boy thrashed and screamed in delirium. He held his son's burning hand, wiping his brow with the cold rag Bridget kept refreshing. Around 4 in the morning, the wind outside began to die down. The thick steam in the room smelled heavily of peppermint and sweat. Arthur was leaning forward, his head resting near Harry's shoulder. He was singing. It was a low, off-key, rumbling baritone, an old sailor's shanty he had learned in his youth, entirely inappropriate for a nursery. But he sang it steadily, a grounding anchor in the storm. Bridget stood by the hearth, stoking the dying embers. She watched the Duke. His hair was a mess, his clothes were ruined. He looked older, tired, and entirely human. Harry's frantic breathing began to slow. The harsh rattle smoothed out. The rigid tension in his small body melted into the mattress. Arthur stopped singing. He pressed his hand to Harry's forehead. "He's cooling," Arthur whispered, afraid to speak too loudly lest he break the spell. He looked up at Bridget, his eyes rimmed with red. "He's sweating." The fever broke. Bridget let out a long, slow breath, leaning her forehead against the cool stone of the mantelpiece. The adrenaline drained from her system, leaving her limbs feeling like lead. "He will sleep now," Bridget said quietly. "Keep him hydrated when he wakes." Arthur looked down at his sleeping son. Then he looked at Bridget. She was standing in the shadows, her rough hands bruised from wringing out cold towels, her posture slumped with exhaustion. She had fought the devil for his son, and she had won. "Thank you," Arthur said. It wasn't a lord thanking a servant. It was a father thanking a savior. Bridget just nodded. "He's your boy. It's what you do." By late April, the mud in the kitchen gardens had dried, giving way to the bright, violent green of early spring. The house had changed. It was no longer a mausoleum. The heavy curtains had been pulled back, allowing the pale sunlight to bleach the Persian rugs. The silence had been replaced by the chaotic, unpredictable noise of living children. Leo and Harry were still terrors, but they were the normal, manageable kind. They argued over who got to feed the hunting hounds, they tracked mud into the foyer, they occasionally broke a teacup. But they no longer screamed in the dark. They no longer destroyed out of malice. They had boundaries, they had chores, and they had a father who actually sat at the head of the dining table every evening. Bridget remained in the nursery. She still wore her coarse wool dresses. She still carried the tin of peppermint salve. She still refused to be called a governess. One Tuesday afternoon, while the boys were in the study agonizing over their sums with a newly hired, highly supervised tutor, Arthur found Bridget in the kitchen garden. She was on her knees, thinning a row of young turnips. Arthur walked out, leaving his boots on the stone path. He wore a simple linen shirt and riding breeches. The grey pallor was entirely gone from his face. He looked solid, grounded. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked over, crouched down in the dirt beside her, and began pulling the small, weak turnip shoots. Bridget glanced at him. She didn't stop working. "You're pulling the strong ones, Your Grace. Leave those. Pull the runts." Arthur chuckled, a low, genuine sound that startled a nearby blackbird. He adjusted his and pulled a smaller shoot. "My apologies. I am still learning the hierarchy of root vegetables." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. The sun was warm on their backs. "I received a letter from Dr. Hughes this morning," Arthur said quietly, tossing a handful of weeds into the bucket. Bridget's hands stopped. The dirt fell from her fingers. She looked at him, a flicker of raw fear finally cracking her stoic mask. "Clara?" she asked, her voice tight. "Her lungs are clear," Arthur said quickly, seeing the panic. "She has gained weight. The doctor believes the worst of the consumption has passed. With continued rest and good food, she will survive." Bridget closed her eyes. She let out a breath that sounded like a sob, dropping her head forward. Her shoulders shook once, violently, before she locked them down. Arthur reached out. He didn't hesitate. He placed his large, clean hand over her dirt-caked one. He didn't flinch at the rough calluses. He squeezed gently. Bridget opened her eyes and looked at his hand covering hers. She didn't pull away. "The £30 a year," Arthur said softly, "is yours for as long as you want it. For Clara. For whatever you need." Bridget looked up at his face. The aristocratic arrogance that had defined him months ago was gone, burned away by grief and rebuilt in the dirt of the stables and the panic of the nursery. "The boys don't need me much longer," Bridget said pragmatically. "They have a tutor. They need someone to teach them how to be lords. I only know how to teach them how to survive. They know how to be lords," Arthur countered. "The blood takes care of that. What they need is someone to keep them honest, someone who isn't afraid of them. Or of me." He moved closer, his knee sinking into the soft garden soil. I am not asking you to be their governess, Bridget, Arthur said, his voice dropping into that quiet, commanding register that sent a strange shiver down her spine. I am asking you to stay. Bridget searched his eyes. She saw the request for what it was. It wasn't a noble offering a maid a comfortable position. It was a man, standing in the ruins of his life, asking the woman who had handed him the bricks to help him finish rebuilding. I won't wear silk, Bridget said bluntly. It catches on everything, and I won't attend your fancy dinners. I don't know which fork to use, and I don't care to learn. Arthur smiled. It was a slow, devastatingly warm smile that reached his eyes. I abhor the dinners anyway. We can eat in the kitchen with Mrs. Patmore, though I suspect she is still terrified of you. She should be, Bridget said, a ghost of a smirk touching her lips. She oversalts the mutton. Arthur laughed out loud. He shifted his hand, interlacing his fingers with hers, ignoring the mud that smeared across his skin. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. There was no need to rush. The frantic, desperate survival was over. They had time now. They had quiet days and messy boys and a house that finally felt like it was breathing again. Bridget looked down at their joined hands, the Duke and the scullery maid. It was absurd. It was scandalous. It was entirely perfect. All right, Bridget said, her voice a low, steady rumble. I'll stay, but if you overwork the bread dough again, I'm putting you back on stable duty. Arthur squeezed her hand. Yes, Mum. If Bridget's pragmatic resilience and Arthur's hard-won redemption kept you hooked until the very end, hit that like button right now. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a story about surviving the darkest parts of grief and finding love in the dirt and the ash. If you crave more deeply grounded emotional historical dramas that skip the cliches and go straight for the heart, subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. What was your favorite moment of Bridget putting the Duke in his place? Tell me in the comments below. I'll see you in the next story.